The night that Alex Gus almost dethroned the greatest fighter in the history of people beating each other up. What would end up being Jon Jones' 6th light heavyweight title defense would also be a bout worthy of the UFC Hall of Fame, as for the first time, not only did Jon see adversity, but he was brought to the brink before rallying in the championship rounds to retain. Theories were abound as to why Jon struggled so much with Alexander Gustafsson. Was it his size? The grappling? Did Gus hurt Jones early and he never fully recovered? All very valid questions, but 3 years after the fight, a revelation from Jones on a small indie podcast with very little listenership completely recontextualized one of the greatest fights of all time.
I did a lot of wild stuff leading up to the fight. I definitely didn't give it my all. 1 week before every fight, I would go out and I would get blacked out wasted. I just felt invincible.
Not only had JBJ taken the Mauler lightly, but his ritual of pre-fight blackouts made it nearly impossible to not look at all of his fights and his greatness in an entirely different light. And that's why it's the first entry in today's video and what we're going to be talking about today. The details that we didn't know until after the fact that entirely changed the way we look at major victories or losses. The kind of information that makes a second viewing of that fight an entirely different experience with the added context. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point, and these are 10 incredible wins that hide part of the story. Number 9, Vitor Belfort versus Randy Couture 2. After 2004 and for the rest of time, when Vitor Belfort is introduced, that announcer is going to say 2 things guaranteed: UFC tournament winner and former UFC champion. And those are absolutely facts. But they're facts much like that Shane Gillis joke.
So technically I'm a Division I football player that is a decorated veteran and was cast on Saturday Night Live. That is my resume, technically.
These things are true, but without context, they're more impressive than they really were. And that is unfortunately the case for Vitor Belfort's title victory over Randy Couture. Randy was actually Vitor's first ever career loss. Couture finished Belfort at UFC 15 on his way to winning his first heavyweight title. The two would meet again 7 years down the line, but this time Randy had captured light heavyweight gold, and Vitor was set to be his first defense. Unfortunately, less than a minute in, a grazing shot on a missed punch would abrade Couture's cornea, and the fight was called off. Technically a TKO victory for Belfort, which technically makes him a UFC champion, technically speaking. An immediate rematch would see Randy take his gold back, and despite 3 other opportunities, Vitor would never win another UFC title. Number 8, Conor McGregor versus Chad Mendes. That Conor McGregor risked his golden ticket, this massive title challenge with Jose Aldo, in order to take on Chad Mendes on short notice. An opponent with a skill set that would very likely be problematic for McGregor was insane enough as it is. He was so popular, and the UFC had sunk so much money into the Aldo fight, he could have absolutely sat it out and waited for his opportunity. Little did we know that Conor was taking an even more insane risk by agreeing to fight Mendes. Now, of course, we all know that McGregor would win. It was one of the biggest moments of his career, but in the notorious documentary that chronicled this period of time, we learned that after Aldo pulled out of the fight and Conor agreed to fight Mendes, he tore his damn ACL.
Is that pop? On my leg? Yeah.
Now, you would think that given everything he had to lose, and given that he would almost certainly need to stop takedowns, that tearing his ACL would have been the end of it. And who would blame him? It's not like it was a broken pinky toe. I'm sorry, that joke was in poor taste. Point being, fighting a wrestler was bad enough. Fighting one with one leg was just straight up reckless. I know, Mendes came in off the couch, but it's still one of the most impressive things Conor has ever done. Number 7, Dan Severn versus Ken Shamrock 2. If you decide to peruse Dan Severn's Wikipedia page, which I'm sure you're doing at least 3 times a week like I am, you're going to notice a few things, like that he has 127 professional fights, which is insane, or that he was in a movie called Swamp Zombies.
And the Oscar goes to...
You might also note that despite losing the inaugural Superfight Championship to Ken Shamrock at UFC 6, he would go on to avenge that loss and become Superfight Champion at UFC 9. But that little green win box is doing a lot of heavy lifting, because the only time Dan Severn ever beat Ken Shamrock is entirely about the context of what happened, because this fight was the infamous dance in Detroit. That's when the UFC got dragged into court the day of the show, with a judge ruling that the only way UFC 9 could happen is if there were no headbutts and no closed fist strikes. SCG told the fighters they'd go to jail if they broke the rules, and Ken took that to heart. Dan forgot a few times.
And he started throwing punches.
As a result, though, both fighters pretty much did nothing for 30 full minutes, with a total of 34 significant strikes landed between the two of them, and I use the word significant very generously. It was pure ass for a half hour, and when it was finished, 2 of 3 judges decided Severn was the winner because they had to say it was one of the two of them. Hilariously, the broadcast team didn't bother to tell the audience at home why the event completely sucked, and later VHS releases touted that everybody tried to stop this event from happening, but didn't touch on what they had to do to make the event take place at all. Also, they call Severn versus Shamrock a super fight slugfest on the back cover. Excuse me. And they say they saved the best for last. Can we sue a company that doesn't exist anymore? SEG needs to pay for their crimes. Number 6, Chuck Liddell versus Tito Ortiz. The rivalry between Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz was a vital piece of the early Zuffa-led UFC puzzle. Their first fight at 47 saw a huge buy rate, triple what they'd ever done since taking over, and their rematch would be the first UFC show over 1 million buys. And neither of these fights should have happened because Chuck Liddell tore his MCL in training prior to both of them. Yeah, that's right, the Iceman could have very easily both times said, you know what, I can barely move, Tito is a hell of a wrestler, it would embarrass me to no end if I lose to this man, I'm going to wait until I'm healthy. But that is not what he did. He fought with one leg and kicked the shit out of Tito twice. Now, it was pretty common knowledge after the fact that Liddell went into the second fight with an MCL tear, but in the last 5 years, Liddell revealed that he'd also injured his knee in the lead up to the first fight.
Right, tore it 2 weeks before the first Tito fight. Run the first round, I kick in the head, right? Not gonna kick again. Done kicking, we're done kicking.
After finding a few interviews with Chuck recounting the injury, I thought perhaps he'd mistaken the first fight with the second. You know, that can happen, but no, because the only detail he consistently brings up when he tells this story is how stupid it was to throw a head kick at the end of the first round with his injured knee, which he only does in the first fight. Chuck Liddell beat Tito Ortiz twice with one leg. It makes his destruction of Tito in this rivalry even more humiliating. Number 5, Anderson Silva versus Chael Sonnen. You know, one major context that seems to go just entirely by the wayside when people talk about this fight, and probably because the narrative of the bout is a lot more compelling when it was Anderson on the very brink of losing everything, pulling off this miracle triangle, which is true, but nobody seems to talk about that it didn't really matter anyway, because Sonnen could have stomped Silva for the rest of that 5th round, and that title was coming back to Anderson by the time that P-test result was in.
Why would you ever take a drug if it wasn't going to enhance your performance?
But that's not the only context that changes the entirety of this fight. I think this detail is even more insane. A year after the bout, the documentary Like Water came out, which chronicled that period of Silva's career and revealed that he had a pretty nasty rib injury going into the fight. An injury that Anderson would later confirm in interviews was actually a broken rib. So the dude went out there against Uber Chael with a broken rib, got his ass beat from pillar to post for 23 minutes, and still pulled off one of the greatest comeback victories of all time. That is my GOAT right there. What a fucking legend. Number 4, Alexander Volkanovski versus Islam Makhachev 2. Fans were absolutely jacked.
I'm jacked to the tits!
When Alexander Volkanovski decided to save UFC 294 by stepping in on 10 days notice to rematch lightweight champion Islam Makhachev. Considering a lot of fans felt Volk should have been given the judge's nod in the first fight, not to mention many believed the accusations levied by Dan Hooker about illegal IV use by Islam prior to the bout, it was like Christmas came early. Volk was coming off his 5th straight title defense at featherweight 3 months prior, and now it was time for some revenge and legacy bolstering double champ status. But fight of the year, this second encounter was not. Volk would be head kick KO'd in just 3 minutes, his first knockout loss since the first year of his career. Immediately, fans pounced on Alex's decision to take the fight on just 10 days notice. But a far more difficult truth about what happened would come to light. Volkanovski had broken his hand in the Yair Rodriguez bout, and surgery would leave him unable to train. It was during that period that he started drinking heavily.
I was drinking every day for like 3-4 weeks. That's unheard of for me. Like every day, like I've never ever done that.
In addition to his lack of training and the daily alcohol, Volk was over 180 pounds. Larger, he said, than he was even when he bulked for the first fight with Makhachev. So why did Alex take the fight? Well, he very candidly spoke about the state he was in that led to that decision at the post-fight press conference.
I never thought I'd struggle with it, but I mean, like, for some reason, when I wasn't fighting or in camp, I just do my head in. You know what I mean? I needed a fight, and then this opportunity come up, and I had to, I had to do it.
Volk's honesty about what really happened prior to that second fight really goes to show that not only do we not know what state a fighter is in when they step into the cage, but we have no idea what their life is like, but for the small window we're given into it when they compete. Number 3, Francis Ngannou versus Cyril Gane. The stakes could not have been any higher for Francis Ngannou when he stepped into the cage for the final fight of his UFC contract against Cyril Gane. Not because he was in danger of losing the heavyweight title to a former teammate, that context was very apparent, and not just because he'd bet on himself in fighting out his UFC contract, and with a loss, he'd have essentially been worthless on the open market. But what we would learn immediately afterwards, and what would happen to Ngannou in his time since that fight, would make his final UFC title defense one of the most high-pressure, life-altering bouts that's ever happened. First, the stuff we learned immediately after the fact. Ngannou's entirely unexpected grappling performance was made all the more impressive when it was revealed that he'd entered the bout with a grade 3 MCL tear, that's the grade where it's completely torn, a partial ACL tear, and damage to his MPFL. That's not a fight promotion, I had to look it up, but it's not a good thing to injure either. All of this in his right knee. How bad was the damage? Ngannou's doctor said that fighting on it could lead to irreparable damage.
I think that was the thing that stuck in my mind. I was concerned about that.
So this dude's entire life is hanging in the balance because if he loses, the UFC is not re-signing him, and nobody else is picking him up for any amount of cash that would be worth it. And he's doing so with a knee that's being held together by thoughts and prayers. Absolutely insane to have taken that fight, let alone dominate it like he did. And while it was a big deal at the time, we had no idea just how massive that win was for Ngannou until after he had his fight with Tyson Fury, setting him up for life. In the context, one of the craziest fights of all time. Number 2, Michael Bisping versus Luke Rockhold. I think the prevailing narrative when people look back on Michael Bisping taking the middleweight title from Luke Rockhold is that Luke got arrogant and that's what cost him. He completely dominated Bisping in their first fight, and so he assumed incorrectly that he could do the same in their rematch. But there's actually quite a bit more to all of this when you know about the proper context. When the two had their first encounter in 2014, fans and commissioners alike were unaware of just how severely compromised Bisping's vision was in his right eye. But when you factor that in with the accidental headbutt in the first 90 seconds of action, which reopened a cut that Mike had suffered a few weeks earlier in camp, blinding his good eye, he essentially fought Rockhold the first time without being able to see him at all. Even more remarkably, despite his vision deteriorating even more by the time they rematched, Bisping, who was not headbutted at the start of that fight, had at least a single eye to keep on Rockhold the second time around and made the champion pay for taking him lightly. Would the Count have won their first encounter if he had not been headbutted? Maybe. But regardless, the reality of his compromised vision in both bouts entirely recontextualizes their rivalry. Number 1, Wanderlei Silva versus Ricardo Arona 2. When Wanderlei Silva, who up to the point of their 2005 middleweight GP semifinal bout hadn't lost in the division in 20 straight fights, took a decision loss to Ricardo Arona, to say it was an upset is a massive understatement. Silva was arguably the best fighter in the world at the time, and so to lose the GP in a non-title bout and then have teammate Shogun Rua defeat Arona immediately afterwards to win the tournament, suddenly the king's place at the very top was put into question. Suddenly Silva had to prove himself again, and he would get his chance when he put his gold on the line for Pride's big New Year's Eve card. The rematch would be a close fight, but if I'm being honest, it probably should have gone to Arona again in my humble opinion. Vandy certainly put up a much better fight, but I think 2 of 3 judges might have got it wrong. Regardless, as it would turn out, the fact that Silva even went out there, let alone won this thing, is a damn miracle, because this, my friends, was the infamous night that Vandy was KO'd backstage by Charles Bennett.
I heard Wanderlei fought after he got knocked out.
He did. After he got
and won.
Out cold. Fought and won.
Now, only up until recently was this legendary altercation anything more than urban legend, with the vast majority of fans believing that Bennett was just talking all kinds of nonsense. But Silva has now confirmed that he did indeed get sucker punch KO'd prior to making the walk that night, which makes his narrow victory absolutely batshit insane. You know who never lost to Ricardo Arona though? The editor of this video, Max Randall. The man is amazing. Please follow him on his socials and go check out his awesome YouTube channel, A a massive thanks to our channel members. Those are the names scrolling by right now. Fight fans, hit the join button, become a channel member, have your name scroll, get exclusive content. I'd highly recommend it. Like and subscribe to beat Tito Ortiz with your torn MCL. Leave a comment about other fights with context that are an entirely different viewing experience. And thank you so much for watching, guys. Have a good one.